investigate your word and to be able to continue to stir that hope up. And we're thankful to you, Father, that you have given us the revelation of your mind. And we're thankful that you have continued to work in human history. And as we are studying this period of time in which you were silent, we are so grateful that we can still see your working in how you were coming about, bringing about your plan of redemption through your Son. We pray that you will bless our time together this evening, and we pray that each one of us will be edified by our time together. We pray that you would be glorified in all that we do, for we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Now, I want to begin a little differently than perhaps what you might think studying the intertestamental period of time, and I want to go back to Genesis chapter 12. And in Genesis chapter 12, at the first few verses, the first couple of verses there, God is speaking to Abram. And he says to him, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great so that you will be a blessing." Verse 3, he says, "I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all of the families of the earth shall be blessed." Okay, now, in that promise, there are three things that God has promised to Abraham that ultimately would come about through his descendants. And what are those three things? Okay, a nation, the nation promise. The reputation, that would be true. Land, that there would be land that they would possess, that they would be a great nation. And then the third and the most significant one is what? They would bless all nations through him. Okay, so this is the covenant that God made with Abraham. And it was a covenant that was going to be fulfilled. No matter what Israel did, God was going to fulfill his covenant through the descendants of Abraham. Okay. Now, what we need to see is that by the time the Old Testament comes to a close, it is now 1,500 years later when we come to the work of Nehemiah, and particularly when we look at the prophet Malachi, which is the last book in our Old Testament. So there is 1,500 years that have transpired between Abraham and Malachi, or Abraham and Nehemiah. And during that 1,500-year period of time, there are obviously profound things that are happening with the nation of Israel, both good and bad. But by the time we get to the close of the Old Testament, what I am suggesting to you is that the future of the promises that God had made to Abraham that would be fulfilled through the nation of Israel looked very bleak. Ever since the 8th century BC, the great united kingdom of David and Solomon had been reduced to just a few thousand people, what was called a remnant. And so it was a mere remnant of what was once a great nation of people by the time the Old Testament particularly comes to its close. And I have a chart up here that illustrates the foreign domination of Israel from the year 722 BC, which was it when Assyria came in and conquered the northern kingdom of Israel, up until AD 135, when is recognized historically as the final fall of the kingdom of Israel, or the people of Israel. I know a lot of times we associate the destruction of Israel with the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And although that is indeed a profound period of time, and it's a very significant point in the history of the Jews, it wasn't until 135 AD that they were completely wiped out. And that was primarily because of a man by the name of Simon Bar Kokhba, who came along and claimed to be a Messiah, and he was starting an uprising, and Rome had just had enough of it, and they just went and annihilated all of them. And from that point on, Israel never existed again in any kind of capacity up until 1946, I think, when they became, once again, they became a nation, but it was not obviously the Israel of the Bible. It was more of what's called a Zionist nation. And so Zionism and Judaism were two completely different things, even though premillennialists, particularly dispensationalists, they might disagree with that, but that's okay. None of you are dispensationalists, so I don't have to argue that point with you. But anyway, what we see is that there was this continual foreign domination. And where I got this particular chart is from the New International Version, the Bible, the Study Bible, which is it's called now the Biblical Theology Study Bible. And this chart is one that I think really helps us to understand and appreciate what was happening during this period of time, at least with respect to the powers that dominated Israel, that whole area, what became known as Palestine, during the period of time from 722 BC up until 135 AD. And so what you see is it started with the Assyrian Empire conquering the northern kingdom of Israel. Then you have the Babylonian Empire that conquered the southern kingdom of Judah. And then after the Babylonian Empire, you have the Persian Empire, which came into power. Now that's all during the Old Testament period of time. The Bible actually records that history. But now we get into the intertestamental period of time. And during the intertestamental period of time is when you have the rise of what they call the Macedonian Greek Empire. I've never heard anybody say it like that. It's the Greek Empire is the way I've always heard it pointed out. I think the reason why it's called this in this particular study Bible is because Philip, who was the initiator of all of this with respect to building a great Greek empire, was a Macedonian. So therefore, they have called it the Macedonian Greek Empire. Basically, it was Hellenistic, and that's Hellenism, or the word Hellenist, is simply a form of the word Greek. And so what you have then is the Greek Empire coming into existence, and then you have Alexander the Great. We're going to talk a little bit about him tonight. But then you have what is just simply broken down into the two generals and their territory, their kingdoms, that actually come into play with respect to the Jewish people, and that would be the Ptolemaic domination and then the Seleucid domination. And this all happened in this intertestamental period of time. Then what wound up happening is the Maccabean Revolt, which we will get to, I think, in lesson number 3 is when we're going to talk about that. The Hasmonean dynasty, which is where the Herods then came from. And we'll talk a little bit about that when we get into, I think, lesson number 5. And then following that is the Roman Empire that then went on from 63 BC until 135 AD, which was when Israel was finally and completely destroyed. And you have all of these, the Herodian dynasty, the Roman governors, the destruction of Jerusalem, and then the second revolt, which ends the Jewish state, which was led, that is, the revolt was led by that guy named Simon Bar Kokhba. Okay, so what we're looking at is this period of time right here, just basically this intertestamental. Now, it doesn't mean we're not going to go back and forth between the New Testament period and the Old Testament period, because obviously those are going to be factors that we will need to note in order to be able to see how God was working. And in fact, there's a passage in Galatians chapter 4 that talks about when the fullness of time came, God sent forth his Son, and born of a woman and born under the law, and all these different kinds of things that Paul talks about. But he uses that expression, the fullness of time, which means the time is ready. And what we are seeing in this intertestamental period of time is how God is making the time ready for the coming of Jesus into the world. So this is an important kind of concept that we need to remember, that Israel is being dominated by foreign powers throughout their entire history, with perhaps the exception of this period of time when they got a little bit of independence during this period of the Hasmonean dynasty. That was a period of about 100 years where they once again actually became an autonomous kingdom for a very short period of time until Rome finally came in and conquered them. Okay, now when we look at the history going all the way back to the period of the Assyrian Empire, how many of the tribes were involved in that? As far as you have the two kingdoms, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. What was the northern kingdom of Israel made up of? Or who, I guess would be better to say. Who was the northern kingdom of Israel made up of? 10 of the tribes, that's right. The only two that were not a part of them were who? Judah and Benjamin were the only two. They are the ones that constituted the southern kingdom. And as we studied about when we were looking at that period of time of the kings, this period of time in which the northern kingdom existed, they had nobody who was of the lineage of David, and there was constant changing and all kinds of intrigue that was going on that led to their ultimate demise. Now, when you look at the southern kingdom of Judah, every king was a descendant of David, even up until the time when they were finally conquered, and then even when they came out of Babylonian captivity, out of Babylonian exile. The governors that were put there were descendants of King David. So there's always been this continual line of King David that has generally come through the southern kingdom. So the northern kingdom, these 10 tribes, that had been exiled by the Assyrian Empire were taken to a land where they were then intermixed with other conquered nations, and for the most part, they actually lost their identity. Okay, now, when David was ruling, this is a map or a chart of David's kingdom. And I want you to note here that David's kingdom stretched from the Mediterranean Sea west of the Jordan River, which would be right here, into all of this region. It went up here as far as the Euphrates and the Tigris rivers, all the way down here into Egypt, and what is this area right here is known as the Gulf of Aqaba. That is the extent of David's kingdom. Solomon's was even further. So this is the kingdom, the United Kingdom, and it is a very powerful kingdom. It has taken all kinds of land. They have all kinds of people who are subjugated to them. And what winds up happening is that as this process of Assyria coming in, followed by Babylon, and then they are set free to come back to their land under the Persian rule, what you see is that this is basically what the province is. This tiny little spot. And that constitutes basically Israel's territory. And what it has been characterized as a place that was about 20 miles long and 20 miles wide that was simply around the city of Jerusalem. So this once magnificent kingdom of David and Solomon has been decimated to the point that now they're just a tiny little dot on the map. And so you can see why it would be that when the book of Malachi comes to a close, and you think about these great promises that God had made to Abraham, it looks as if Israel's in dire straits here. How is God going to do this? And so things look relatively bleak, I would say. And so with this in mind, we are now ready to begin our study. And as I pointed out to you, we're dividing this into three major sections. That is our class into three major sections, where first we're going to cover the story, then we're going to cover the literature that was written during this period of time, and then what we're going to do is talk about the people, because the people had become vastly different, the changes that had been made throughout that period of time as well. And one observation I would make, and I think that Farrell made this in his work, that as we go through this period of time, we need to keep in mind that the key events that we will be covering, we may not know the exact date. Nobody really knows exactly. You have different people depending upon what scholar you may be reading after or what historian you may be reading after. They may come up with a different date. So references to the dates may in fact be different, again, depending upon the source that you might consult. And so we're now ready to actually begin the first part of the story, examining the history of Israel during the time of the Persians and the Greeks. Now, I put this up here, and I know you can't read it. It's really horrible. I tried to find a timeline, basically, that I thought could help us go through this. And I know that this is hard for you to see. I may actually put this on the website too, so that you might be able to download this particular. Because we're gonna go to this quite frequently throughout the class period, at least as we go through the story part. But what I want to point out to you is where it begins up here in the Persian period of time in 410. And it goes down here to 30 AD, which is the period of time in which Jesus was crucified. So you're covering right around 450 years is what we're talking about. Now the period that we're going to be looking at today is this period right here, under Alexander the Great, how he conquers the East, and Alexander's years of power, which is not very long. There's a great deal that can be said about it, but it's not a very long period of time in which he actually was involved in his work as the king of Greece. Okay, so you'll see this chart popping up from time to time. And again, if I get enough feedback that you would like to have this actually in your possession, then I will make sure that is put up on the website, and I might even make some copies of it because it is in a PDF file. Make some copies of it so that you can at least follow along with the timeline as we go through all of this. Okay, so we're going to begin first of all with the Persians. And it's important that we do that because that's when the Old Testament closes. And in the book that you have, there is a listing of the different Persian kings who ruled during this period of time. Now, they were known as the Achaemenid dynasty. And basically what that means is that they were all from a guy by the name of Achaemenid. He's the one, in fact, Cyrus the Great is actually Cyrus II. And so there was somebody before him, but that was before they actually became this world empire that they did, led by Cyrus. And so the first question that I had on the question sheet was to list the Persian kings who ruled during biblical history. And then I asked you who was the last king of Persia when the Old Testament history ends. Now really what I'm interested more so is that last question. We're going to look at all of these kings here in a minute. But it's the last part of that question, or the last question in that question, that I'm more interested in, that we need to keep in mind. And so, who was the last king of Persia when the Old Testament history comes to an end? Artaxerxes, okay? Artaxerxes, in fact, his name was Artaxerxes I or Artaxerxes Longimanus. Okay, so he is the one who is ruling when the Old Testament history comes to a close. But, as you can see on the chart, he comes way down here. There's a bunch of kings, bunch of rulers of Persia that came long before Artaxerxes came along. In fact, you're talking about a period of about 130 years from the beginning of the Persian dynasty up until the time the Old Testament comes to a close, as far as that historical element is concerned, because it ends around 424 BC. Okay, so the first king that we have on this list is Cyrus, known as Cyrus the Great. He was also Cyrus II. And what do we remember? What is it about him that we remember from biblical history, from what is recorded in the Bible? Okay, he is the one who permitted the Jews to go back to Jerusalem. This was his policy. And he did that not with just the Jews, but with all the conquered peoples. He sent them all back to their lands. And of course, he did that because of political purposes in order to be able to, gain loyalty from these people that they would not turn against him. And it was also under his leadership that the Babylonian Empire was conquered. And you can read about that in Daniel chapter 5. How it was that this took place during the reign of one of the kings of Babylon. I believe it was Belshazzar who was reigning at that time. And what wound up happening was basically Persia just walked in there. So he comes to power. And what is also interesting about this is that there had been prophecies that had been spoken hundreds of years before he even was born, in which this was going to happen. You remember how in the book of Isaiah, in the 44th chapter, beginning in verse 28 up through chapter 45, verse 1, it speaks about my servant Cyrus, who will be the ones who will do this. And then Ezra, in Ezra chapter 1, verses 1 and 2, in fact, it's the way 2 Chronicles ends, is the way Ezra chapter 1 begins, talking about this Cyrus, who had been spoken of as the one who God had ordained to come into power. And so that's what we remember him for. Now, the second one in line is this guy by the name of Cambyses. What do we know about Cambyses from biblical history? Nothing. We know absolutely nothing about him from biblical history because he didn't have any relevancy in that period of, or at least in that part of the world, that is in Palestine during this period of time. But there is something that's interesting to note about him, and that is that it was during his reign that Egypt was added to the list of nations that had been conquered by Persia. So Cyrus didn't conquer Egypt, but it was Cambyses who went and conquered Egypt. Now the next one on this list, it is not in Farrell Jenkins' list. He doesn't put him there, and I think for legitimate purposes. And that is this guy by the name of Pseudo-Smerdis. The reason why he's not there is because he only ruled for a couple of months. And basically, he was someone who tried to take the throne once Cambyses died. In fact, it's interesting. I did not a whole lot, but I did spend about a half an hour researching this guy just to see who he was. And what I found out is that there's a huge debate among historians as to just exactly who this guy was. There are some who have argued that he was a son of Cyrus the Great, therefore making him a brother to Cambyses. There are others who argue that he was actually a general in Cambyses' army who simply usurped the throne after Cambyses died. We really don't know who this guy was. And again, it really doesn't matter because he only ruled for a couple of months, and then Darius or Darius I is the one who then came into power. He is the one who is known as Darius the Great. What is interesting about him, though, is that although he is of Achaemenid blood, he is not a direct descendant of Cyrus. He's probably a cousin, but still he is of Achaemenid blood. And he is the one who is actually recognized as the king of Persia who unified the vast territory that took up this entire Persian Empire. And he's also recognized as the ruler of Persia who began aggression against Greece. He sought to expand the Persian territory into the European continent, and he was ultimately defeated by the Greeks at what is called the Battle of Marathon in 490 BC. The actual Greeks they went up against was not a united Greek kingdom because it didn't exist at this point. But what it was one of the city-states. It was Athens. And so the Athenians held him back in this Battle of Marathon. And you can read about that. It's an interesting, in fact, this is what begins in 490 BC, is where you begin to read about and to learn about the Greco-Persian Wars, which went on for a period of a couple of hundred years. So it starts at the Battle of Marathon by Darius I, who tries to go into Greece, and he is turned back by the Athenians. According to biblical history, what do we remember about Darius I? He's the one, you remember, who ordered the Temple at Jerusalem to be rebuilt after the construction had stopped. And you read about that in Ezra chapter 6, that Darius I was the one who gave the orders to let these Jews build this temple and gave them all that they needed in order to be able to do that. Okay, following Darius I, then is Xerxes I. And he is the Ahasuerus of the book of Esther. And he is the one who ruled Persia during the events that is recorded in the book of Esther. And it also speaks about the vast territory of Persia during that period of time, as it talks about 127 provinces that he ruled over. So the empire is vast. Now, Xerxes didn't conquer all of that. It was Darius that did, and he brought it together. What he is known for, though, interestingly enough, is his continual aggression against Greece, as he tried to expand Persian rule further into the west, only to be finally driven back at what is called the Battle of Salamis, which occurred in 480 BC. And then there were subsequent skirmishes that followed. One of those was that probably most of us have heard of was the Battle of Thermopylae, the Gates of Fire. In fact, they've made movies about that, about these 300 Spartans who stopped the Persian Empire, this vast Persian Empire, at least initially, from going into Greece. Now, ultimately, they did go in, but it wasn't because these Spartans didn't try to stop it. In fact, they did for at least a period of time. So Xerxes I is the one who really begins the aggression against Greece. And he is this Ahasuerus guy that is spoken of in the book of Esther. And I have more to say about that in just a minute. And then following him is Artaxerxes I, also known as Artaxerxes Longimanus. Now, what is interesting to me is that according to historians, he was actually a minor Persian king. There was nothing really significant about him. But when you look at it from a biblical perspective, he is of major importance because of his connection with the Jewish people. So what is it about Artaxerxes I that we remember from our studies, particularly Dan's study that he had in the book of Ezra and Nehemiah? That's right. He is the one who gave them the power, gave them everything that they needed in order to be able to go in and to rebuild the walls around the city of Jerusalem. And so that's what he's known for. Otherwise, he's not known for much of anything else. So really, only as far as Jewish history is concerned, is Artaxerxes I very significant. Now, it was during his reign that the Old Testament history comes to an end, with Judah and with all of the ancient Near East being under the rule and the domination of the Persian Empire, which lasted for another century until the rise of the Greek or the Hellenist Empire. Now, there are a number of kings, as you can see, that continued to rule during that next century. Kings like Xerxes II, Darius II, Artaxerxes II, Artaxerxes III, a guy by the name of Arsus, and then Darius III. And Darius III, if you're interested in the historical elements that come into play with respect to Greece, Persia, and in the region of Palestine, remember him. Because Darius III is the last king, the last great king of the Persian Empire. And it was during his rule that Alexander comes down and just basically cleans up. So he's the only one, as far as these other kings are concerned, this last one right here, Darius III, he's the only one that is really of significance as far as this intertestamental period of time is concerned. Okay, so now there were other geopolitical developments that were going on too. And here's a map of the Persian Empire. And there's all kinds of geopolitical things that are going on. As far as Israel's history is concerned, there's not a great deal that is known concerning the Jews during this last part of the Persian Empire's dominance. But it is known that there were communities that were being formed outside of the region of Palestine. And what are they called? What was that called? The dispersion, or the diaspora. Mark it said last week that it was Latin, and I was confusing that, I think, with Diadochi, which is the four generals, which is Latin. Mark had brought it to my attention that the word diaspora is actually Greek. It's a Greek word for dispersion, and that's what we're talking about then. And again, as I pointed out to you last week, there were many Jewish communities that by this time, and in fact way before this time, had already begun to form back in Egypt. That goes all the way back to the days of Jeremiah. Even before then, you have these Jews who were dispersed because of the Assyrian exile and the Babylonian exile. But communities are now beginning to be formed, particularly in the regions of Egypt. And that's significant because of what develops during the period of time when we get to the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, which we'll talk more about that next week. But during the time of Persian dominance, in the middle of the 5th century, there was a community that, interestingly enough, was a Jewish community that was known as Elephantine. I think that Farrell mentions that in his work. And Elephantine is interesting because it was made up only of Jews, and it was smack dab in the middle of the Nile River in what is called Upper Egypt. And the reason why this area is called Upper Egypt, well, let me give you another map here. The reason why it's called Upper Egypt is because which way does the Nile River flow? It flows north. So this means it's going, the elevation is going down. And so when it talks about Upper Egypt, even though when we think upper, when we look at a map, we're thinking north, to them, upper meant elevation. And so when you deal with Upper Egypt, it's this region right here, and this is where Elephantine was, down here in the Nile River. And there is a city that's still there. I don't believe it's just made up of Jews, but it's still there. It's got a different name to it now, but it was an island that was stuck right in the middle of the Nile River, and that becomes significant because it was some of these Jews who helped in the process of the development of what eventually became known as the Septuagint version of the Bible. And it was also during this period of time that what you see happening in, again, the geopolitical circumstances that were going on, is Persia is continuing to go this direction, and they're continuing to go this direction. So they're very aggressive, and they are wanting to go further to the southwest as well as further to the northwest to continue their domination as a world empire. And what wound up happening is that they were confronted with an empire. Well, it wasn't an empire yet, but it was beginning to develop. That is, the Greek city-states were growing in power, defending their territory against the aggressive Persians. And eventually what wound up happening is that these Greek city-states became a united kingdom, and then they became the aggressors against Persia. It was during this reign of Darius III when Greece actually rose as the next world empire, Greece having one primary objective, and that is they're going to transport their culture, their language, everything about Greece is going to be transported to this part of the world. So Hellenism now becomes a significant influence that the Greeks are going to make sure is being passed on as they continue to take more and more of this territory of Persia. Okay, now this next chart I have is the Greek Empire. And you can see that the land area is pretty much the same as the Persian area. And that's basically what happened. The red lines that are on the map is actually the route of Alexander as he went through the process of doing it. But before we get into that, I just want to make the observation that the actual beginnings of the Greek Empire is actually founded in mythology. It goes back to, I don't know who it goes back to actually, but it's founded in mythology. But it is believed that Greece itself goes back as far as the 12th century BC. And when I say Greece, I'm talking about these city-states, they weren't even city-states at that time. They were just collections of people living in towns in this area that people like the Athenians, the Spartans, and people like that, the Macedonians, who lived in those areas and basically were just taking care of their own business, minding their own business, just living their lives. The beginning of authentic Greece history, though, is usually associated with what is called the First Olympiad in 776 BC. And from that time until 500 BC, the Hellenic or the Greek city-states began to be organized. And the two biggest city-states were Athens and Sparta. Now, what is also interesting is that you read back during this period of time, around the latter part of the 4th, or the latter part of the 5th, the early part of the 4th century BC, there was you probably heard about it, the Peloponnesian Wars. And the Peloponnesian Wars, which we're not going to get into except to make this observation, this was Sparta and Athens fighting with each other. So even among these Greek city-states, they were in conflict with one another. And that's an important thing to remember as we continue to develop this history, because these are people that culturally they're the same, but they just don't get along with one another, and they're trying to take each other's land and territory and all of this kind of stuff. And it's during this period of time that the Persians are also beginning their process. Around 490 BC, as I pointed out, with Darius I, who actually went in and they had this Battle of Marathon. Then during Xerxes' reign, you have the Battle of Salamis and the Battle of Thermopylae. And in fact, I believe, Dan, didn't you mention in Esther how that during this period, this party they were having, that he's actually coming back from a battle, getting ready to go into another battle? And that's what this was talking about. In 480 BC, there were two major conflicts in the Greco-Persian War, the Greco-Persian Wars. And that was the Battle of Salamis and the Battle of Thermopylae. And so when you read the book of Esther, as Dan pointed out when we were studying that, when you read that and they're having this big party and all this kind of stuff, that's when Vashti comes into it. When they're having all of this is in between those two battles. So he's come back basically with his tail tucked between his legs, and he's getting ready to go again. Only now he's going to go a different route. And he is going to be successful in that particular venture, even though he faces the Spartans there at the Battle of Thermopylae, but all they did was just simply slow it down. It didn't stop it from happening. Okay, now, during this middle part of the 4th century, there were all kinds of enormous changes that were taking place. Again, as we noted, that throughout the dominance of the Persian Empire, Persia was always hungry to further their territorial control. And so they are identified as one of the most aggressive ancient empires of ancient history. And they're continually pushing further to the west into territories of both Egypt and Greece. Now, during this period of time, Greece was not a unified people. They existed, as I said, as these independent city-states. They were autonomous from one another, independent from one another. For the most part, they got along with one another, except perhaps the Athenians and the Spartans, where they had conflicts with one another. But it was the aggression of the Persian Empire that ultimately led these independent, autonomous city-states to come to realize we need to unite. And they formed one kingdom that together provided them with the strength and with the resources that they needed initially to defend themselves against the Persians, but eventually to become the aggressors and to go after Persia. Which brings us then to question number 3. Who was the first king of the United Greek Kingdom? Philip. Philip of Macedon is the first one. And he ruled not for a very long period of time. He ruled for about 23 years. And so the beginning of the formation of the Greek Empire is actually attributed to Philip of Macedon, who is recognized as really the genius behind the foundation of Greece as an empire, because it was because of him, because of his charisma, because of his ability to communicate, he had the ability then to bring all of these city-states that were independent and autonomous, to bring them under one ruler. And that was him. Now technically, and again, Farrell points this out in his book, technically he was not a Greek. He was a Macedonian. But he came to understand something. And where he learned this from was from Socrates, or maybe it was Aristotle. It was one of those Greek philosophers. But he came to understand that the only way Persia could ever be defeated is if these Greek city-states came together as one. And knowing that he would probably not live to see what he so badly desired, he trained his son, Alexander, to carry out his own ambitions. Which brings us then to question 4. Who is recognized as the greatest of the kings of the Greek Empire? And ask you, why do you think he was considered to be the greatest? Who was the greatest? Still to this day recognized as the greatest of the Greek kings, and is recognized, particularly in military history, as one of the greatest generals in all of military conflict. Alexander. Alexander III of Macedon was his name, but he became known as Alexander the Great. And Farrell makes some interesting observations on page 3, some things that I highlighted that I think are important. He quotes Charles Pfeiffer, and he points out how that, like most leaders, Alexander represented a mass of conflicting strands. He was a Macedonian by nationality. He dreamed of national glory as the heir of Philip. Culturally, he was a Greek educated by Aristotle himself. At the age of 13, he was taught by Aristotle. And here was Aristotle's political philosophy, and that is that the Greeks might govern the world could they but combine into one political society. And that's what Philip began to do, and that's what Alexander saw to. Okay, so after the death of Philip, Alexander no longer wants to simply remain a defender of Greek territory. And so primarily in retaliation against Persia, he became the aggressor. And at the age of 20, now let that sink in. At the age of 20, he took his army to fight the Persians, who at that time was being ruled by Darius III, who was the last of the great Persian kings. So we've only got about 5 minutes left, so I'm just going to go through this rather hurriedly, but I hope in enough detail that it gives you the things that you need to know about how the historical flow is going. So what Alexander does is he begins to move eastward. He leaves this region and he goes across what is called the Hellespont. Today it is known as the Dardanelles. And what that is, it's a very thin area of water. It's a strait of water that connects the Aegean Sea with the Sea of Marmara. That's what they're called today, located in northwest Turkey. And what this strait did is it actually formed a boundary between the continents of Europe and Asia. And so he crosses the Hellespont with his army. And now, mind you, his army is only about 35,000 men. And there he meets, for the first conflict, he meets the Persian army, or at least part of it, in what is called the Battle of Granicus on the Granicus River, which is right here. So that's his first battle. And he overwhelmingly defeats them, which gives him then the confidence to continue to pursue Persia. And so you begin to see his route. And one of the things, and I made this observation last week, you'll notice that his route begins by taking all control of the Mediterranean coast. And the reason for that was because Alexander knew Persia had a powerful navy. And in order to be able to cut that navy off, he had to cut the port cities off. And so he went in and began conquering these port cities before he did anything else. And so the first conflict that actually was the death knell to the Persian Empire took place in Issus, right here at the corner. This is where Tarsus would have been located, where Paul was from. So this is the first battle that is of major consequence. And what is interesting, as I was reading about this, he had 35,000 men. And the Persian army, it's been estimated, had anywhere between 250,000 and 600,000 men. So they had 10 or 20 times the amount of men that Alexander had. And yet he was such a good general that he could defeat the Persian army. And part of that was because many of the people who were in Persia were actually, they had been drafted into this army, and they weren't as loyal to Persia as these Greeks were loyal to their commander. And so following that victory, he then proceeded along the coast. He takes one coastal town after another. And it's during this period of time that Alexander defeated what was considered to be almost an impregnable city, and that is the port city of Tyre. Now, it's prophesied about in Zechariah 9. I'm not going to take the time to look at that, except simply to point out that Tyre, it was prophesied that Tyre, which thought they could not be destroyed, was destroyed by Alexander. And Pharaoh goes into some detail about that event that took place, and it's really quite interesting. And so from there, he proceeds to Jerusalem. And where Jewish tradition, what Jewish tradition says about this is he spared the city of Jerusalem because a high priest by the name of Jaddua greeted him with reverence and awe, and he showed him out of the prophecies of Daniel, Daniel's chapters 2, 7, and 8, that he is the one who would conquer Persia. Josephus speaks about this in the Antiquities and in chapter 11. So he speaks about how that you're the guy God said is going to come in here. And interestingly enough, Jaddua was right. That is who God had prophesied would come in and do this. Now the story is really interesting, but we don't have time to get into the detail of it. Again, a lot of that is referred to by Farrell in his book. There has been debate over not whether that story is true or if it's just a legend. But whatever the case, whether it's true or not, it's true that Alexander spared Jerusalem. And in fact, he allowed the Jews to continue in their laws and in their religion. And with that then, he heads further into the southwest. He goes towards Egypt. Pharaoh points out how it was that he was recognized as a pharaoh. He conquers the Persian domination. He founds the city of Alexandria. And guess who was named after? It just shows you the kind of the narcissistic guy he was. He named it after himself. Let me go back here. The city of Alexandria, which was located right here. Right there at the Nile River where it goes through. Okay. So, let me get here back into my notes. So he proceeds southward into Egypt. From Egypt, he heads back through Palestine towards Susa. Susa's right here. There were three capitals. There was Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. These were the three capitals of Persia, and he's going to go get them all. And so he begins by going, first of all, to Susa. He continues going through all of this battle. And it is at Susa he meets for the final time Darius III in what is called the Battle of Gaugamela. And it was on the Tigris River. He overwhelmingly defeated the Persians, and he brought to an end the Achaemenid dynasty, and he now takes upon himself the title King of Kings. Now, and I think that's interesting. He calls himself the King of Kings. So he continues his military campaign as far east as the Punjab area of India, which was over in here. He comes up, goes through the Indus River, comes through here. But by the time they get into here, it's been a long time, and his men tell him, "We're not going with you any further. We've conquered enough." And so they turn and they begin the process to go home. They make it back to Babylon in 323 BC. And at that time, Alexander had great plans to make Babylon a center of commercial power, but it didn't happen because at the age of 32, he became sick with a fever and he died. So it took him 12 years to conquer the Persian Empire. And he started at the age of 20, he ended at the age of 32. It's been said, I think that this is, again, a legend, but it has been said that before his untimely death, he lamented that he had no more worlds to conquer. Now, that quote is disputed, but anyway, it would sound like something Alexander would say. So, although Alexander remained on the historical scene for a very short period of time, his impact in ancient history in the Near East was profound, leaving as one of his greatest legacies the transmission of Hellenistic culture everywhere he went. He established model Greek cities like Alexandria in Egypt. And because of him and those who followed after him, the influence of Greek culture, the Greek language, and by the way, what was the language of the New Testament period of time? It was Greek. Okay, so the Greek language is now all over the place. Greek arts are felt by the entire world, including the Jews in Palestine. Many of them had become Hellenists, and they had begun to adopt their culture. Now, after Alexander died, and this is where we'll end, after Alexander died, he left no heir to his throne. I mean, after all, he's 32. He thought he was going to live longer. So he left no heir to his throne, and that brought about for the next 2 decades conflict between several of his generals who fought for the control of the empire. And these were the generals. Cassander, right here in the region of Macedonia, Lysimachus here in Thrace, Seleucus, who is over here, and he had the largest region, and then down here Ptolemy. And these are the two that impact Jewish history. The other two don't come into play at all. And that's where we're going to begin next week, as we think about the Ptolemies and the Seleucids, and what wound up happening to this region of Palestine during that period of time. So again, as I said to you before, God may not have been giving all kinds of revelation, so in that sense he was silent. But man, he was not quiet, was he? He's working. And he's working to bring about the fullness of time. And one of the first elements of that is the Greek language. Okay, thank you all for your participation tonight.